Finally, tradition. This is probably the aspect of the Catholic view of life and learning that most attracts notice among non-Catholics. At the level of the life of piety, Catholics are said to hold on to obsolete practices and discredited moral views long past their sell-by date. At the level of inquiry, it is observed that their intellectual energies look backward, not forward. They even quote as authoritative the views of medieval theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas. There is a kind of indiscriminate imprecision in these attitudes. I wonder, for one thing, whether the Church's use of St. Thomas really differs categorically from a Lutheran's use of Luther or a Reformed theologian's use of Calvin. In this regard, the Catholic difference, categorically, would really be a matter of the richness of its intellectual and theological resources. There are 33 saints who have been proclaimed doctors of the Church, ranging across the centuries. The Dominican and Franciscan and Augustinian and Jesuit theologians famously disagree wildly over many matters. And while St. Thomas is considered the common doctor, the touchstone for most Catholic doctrine, on at least one matter, the Church has declared as dogma a teaching which St. Thomas held to be erroneous, the Church relying in this case on arguments from Duns Scotus. Moreover, tradition is nothing but the history of rational arguments, and to delve into tradition with any seriousness of Christian purpose is to recognize that the Church has had very good reasons for the conclusions it has reached concerning doctrine. The Church's tradition is a tradition of reason, carefully guarding the deposit of faith. If someone today would propose an Arian Christology, for example, the arguments of St. Athanasius remain ready to hand. Catholics are bound by tradition because tradition constitutes the most completely reasoned articulation of the faith in our day. Nevertheless, to recognize tradition as tradition, to study the history of the sources, is to recognize that doctrine develops. It is not static. The Church always stands ready, upon due consideration, to change its doctrine if good and compelling reasons are presented. This coming Sunday, John Henry Cardinal Newman will be beatified by Pope Benedict XVI in England. I am confident that in time, John Henry Newman will be proclaimed a doctor of the Church. Newman, a 19th century Oxford theologian and Catholic convert, is the thinker in the Catholic tradition who thought most carefully about the nature and limits of the development of doctrine. And in his great work on that subject, he summed up the Catholic view in this way: to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. So perhaps another way of viewing the Church's backwardness is to say that it thinks in terms of centuries. The very weight of tradition, its intellectual power, means that novelty, so thoughtlessly praised in the modern age, will mostly be found, at length, to be in error. As an example, consider the ordination of women, a matter on which the Church is said to be out of touch with what we all know now. But this is a serious matter. It is said that the reservation of the priesthood to men only is merely a cultural legacy from a more patriarchal age. But that cannot be quite right. We know that Jesus associated with women in ways that were dramatically unusual in his cultural milieu. We also know that from the earliest times and down through the centuries, women in Christian societies have been held in higher esteem than in any other culture. Nevertheless, women were not among the 12. Why would this be so? Faced with such a conundrum, the Church must reflect on what amounts to a new question. Why did God create man in two sexes? What is the theological significance of this fact? Until we have compelling theological arguments here, we will not be able to say whether we are warranted to ordain women. We will not be able to say whether the movement to ordain women represents a movement of the Spirit or merely of the spirit of the age. We are only at the beginning of what will no doubt be a century-long theological investigation. In the meantime, since no one has a right to ordination, so there is no injustice in withholding ordination today. Earlier I mentioned the priority of the Church to Scripture. The Catholic view of the Christian life is one of life in the Church. And the Church is not simply the collection of all Christian believers scattered across the globe, each in his individual relationship with Christ. Rather, the Church is a substance, the ark of salvation. The Church is a single subject. Often, in fact, the Church is personified. She is the bride of Christ, and so she warrants the feminine pronoun. She is a she, not an it. Like a person, she is both the same and different over time. She grows older, she puts on a little weight, but in doing so, she does not become someone else. She is always the same person. St. Augustine, in his De Trinitate, associated God the Father with the faculty of memory in the human soul. It is in memory that our identity as a person abides through time. And so it is with tradition, the memory of the Church. And just a brief closing thought. At the beginning, I observed that the classical Protestant objection to Catholicism is that it represents the captivity of the gospel to pagan philosophy. As we have seen, Catholicism takes quite another view. In Pope Benedict's Regensburg address in September 2006, the lecture you may remember, which inflamed the Muslim world, as the Pope quoted the words of the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Paleologos to the effect that if you examine what Muhammad brought that was new, quote, you will find things only evil and inhuman, Pope Benedict argues in this address that the encounter between biblical faith and Greek philosophy was a providential event. It did not come about by chance. In Acts 16, 6-10, St. Paul finds the roads to Asia barred, and he sees a vision of a Greek man saying, come over into Macedonia and help us. The apostle is drawn to proclaim the good news within the Greek world. But already, Pope Benedict argues in this lecture, quote, a profound encounter of faith and reason and an encounter between genuine enlightenment and religion, unquote, had been occurring for some time. We see this, for example, in the Greek philosophical sources that appear in the Christian scripture, in the scriptures themselves, in the Old Testament wisdom literature, in the Septuagint, which the Pope describes as an independent textual witness and a distinct and important step in the history of revelation. And of course, preeminently at the beginning of the Gospel of John, which is the final word on the biblical concept of God. So, the encounter with Greek philosophy. Some would say that it was only happenstance. But from a Catholic point of view, the synthesis of biblical faith with Greek philosophy that occurred at the beginning of the Christian era is something which will remain permanently a feature of all authentic Christianity, even to the close of the age. Thank you.